On the 11th of April 2021, a young man named Daunte Wright was fatally shot and killed during a traffic stop and an arrest on outstanding warrants in Minneapolis, Minnesota, United States of America. Today on Don't Talk TV, I'm going to take a look at that arrest, do a breakdown of it from the perspective of Canadian law. Hello, my name is Nicholas Wansbutter. I'm a criminal defense lawyer in Stratford, Ontario, Canada, and welcome to Don't Talk TV. Now, viewers may have noticed I didn't have an episode out on Monday. I've just been extremely busy with a multi-day trial and Easter over the last couple of weeks, but I've scrounged together some time to put together another video for you, at least for this week, and I wanted to take a look at the recent events from this past Monday, the 11th of April, in the United States. So as I mentioned in the preamble, a young African-American man named Daunte Wright was pulled over at about 2 p.m. that day by Officer Kimberly Potter, along with two male officers. He was pulled over for an expired registration on his plate, but once officers pulled him over, they discovered that there was a number of warrants for his arrest. They attempted to arrest him. He escaped, and during that escape, he was shot. The Brooklyn Center Police, which is a suburb of Minneapolis, and that's the police force that was involved, they've released the body camera footage. So before we look at the footage, I just want to refresh on a couple of things. At least if this were to happen in Canada, some of the laws that would be in play. Certainly, police have the right to pull over any motorist. They don't even need a reason. You don't have to violate the law in order to be pulled over. Section 216 of the Highway Traffic Act of Ontario gives the police the right to pull over any vehicle at any time to check on anything to do with the Highway Traffic Act, including checking to see whether you have your license with you, since providing your license to police is a requirement. This is the same for any licensed activity. If you're hunting, conservation officers can stop you and you're required to show them your hunting license. Same if you're fishing, you would be required to stop and show them your fishing license. Same applies to Highway Traffic Act and when you're driving, because it's a licensed activity, so you don't have that same right to simply ignore police or not to stop. Now that said, once they stopped him, they discovered that he had some warrants out for his arrest. And as I've mentioned in previous episodes, police have the right to use reasonable force in order to effect an arrest. And reasonable force isn't a one-size-fits-all. Different force is going to be required in different circumstances depending on what the person's being arrested for, what they're doing, whether they're fighting with police, whether they're fleeing, etc. So, in my view, it would be relevant to consider what was in the mind of police, what was necessary, how dangerous the situation was, to consider what they believed they were arresting him for. So I have an article here from Fox News. So according to Fox News, Mr. Wright had been accused of choking and robbing a woman at gunpoint and had an arrest warrant for that. And they give some details. I mean, he would have been presumed innocent until proven guilty, so I'm not too interested in the specifics of it, other than the fact that it's a robbery with a firearm that the police knew he was out on bail for. And the fact here that he was arrested and released on a $100,000 bail. As a condition of that bail, he was not to have contact with the victim or witnesses, had to refrain from drugs and alcohol, and could not possess a firearm. So his bail was revoked in July because he allegedly possessed a firearm and was not keeping in touch with his probation officer, according to documents obtained by Fox News. Though apparently the charge that he had a warrant for was first-degree aggravated robbery with a firearm. So, in my view, it would be legitimate for police to have that in their minds, and the fact that the bail was revoked, the reason he had a warrant for his arrest was because he'd unlawfully been in possession of a firearm, so they don't know if he has a firearm here. They may have had a little bit of heightened concern for their safety going into this. But now let's look at how things play out as we watch the body cam video. So you can see things are going along fairly fine until Mr. Wright, the female officer, is trying to take control of his arm. He pulls his arm out and jumps into his vehicle. Now it appears one of the male officers is trying to pull Mr. Wright back out of the vehicle. Now Officer Potter has drawn her firearm. You can see clearly in her right hand a black handgun that she's pointing at him, although you can hear her shouting at him, "I'm gonna tase you, taser, taser, taser." Now, you don't hear a gunshot, but obviously one went off because Mr. Wright was shot and died of a gun wound. But you see the officer, she drops the handgun and you hear her say, "Holy shit, I shot him." Now, the Brooklyn Center Police have said that their viewing of the video, they believe that she thought she had a taser out and she accidentally shot Mr. Wright.
As I watched the video and listened to the officer's commands, it is my belief that the officer had the intention to deploy their taser, but instead shot Mr. Wright with a single bullet. This appears to me, from what I viewed and the officer's reaction and distress immediately after, that this was an accidental discharge.
Now, watching the video, the officer does seem to express some legitimate surprise and shock that she shot him. There may be legitimacy to the fact that she thought she had pulled out her firearm, but on the other hand, that seems very hard to understand. How could an individual have a firearm in their hand and think it's a taser? Any police officer I've ever seen, they have their sidearm or pistol on one hip and the taser on the other hip. And this makes sense for a number of reasons. One, to prevent confusing which one you're pulling out, but also, if you have both weapons on one hip, your duty belt's going to be unbalanced, but it'd be very cumbersome and hard to try and draw one or the other of them because they'd be getting in each other's way. I haven't seen any photographs of how Officer Potter wore her taser and firearm, but you can see in the video that one of the other officers that's in view, he has the taser on his left hip and pistol on his right hip. It seems most likely that that's the way she had it, so I don't understand how she could accidentally pull her sidearm instead of her taser when it's on the opposite hip. Secondly, there's a big difference in the feel and weight of a taser versus a pistol. The media don't know what type of pistol she had. I don't know either. I'm just looking on Wikipedia, seeing the firearms that are authorized for use by this police force. It could have been a Smith & Wesson M&P, and they're available in either 9mm or .45 caliber. Smith & Wesson M&P, now keep in mind this is unloaded without any bullets in it, and bullets have a weight to them as well, but an unloaded Smith & Wesson, it would be 700 grams on the low end for a 9mm, up to 840 grams on the higher end, so we're getting close to a kilogram or a pound and a half. Another option they had would be the Sig Sauer P320. Those are 730 grams on the low end, up to 830 grams on the higher end for a .45 caliber. So again, this is very similar weight range. Third option would be a Glock 17. And again, those, a 9mm Glock 17 would be around 705 grams with an empty magazine. A full magazine is going to add at least a few hundred grams. So we're getting close to a 2-pound item when an officer has a firearm drawn in their hand. And you can see it has metal. You can see the way the grip looks on each of these. It's a very clear pistol grip and where the trigger is located. And also, most of these firearms, they have a safety trigger before you can pull the trigger. So you can't just accidentally pull the trigger. Compare that to a taser, which, as you can see, ergonomically, it's quite different. And a taser is 225 grams. That's less than half the weight of a firearm, and a taser is completely plastic, so it's going to have a completely different feel. I don't know what the trigger pull weight is on a taser, but I suspect it's significantly less than the trigger pull on a standard Smith & Wesson M&P, Sig Sauer P320, or Glock 17. Unless the officer has altered the trigger to have a hair trigger, which would be a whole other issue of dangerousness in and of its own. I find it very hard to understand how she could have accidentally drawn her firearm. aside from the fact that it seems like she's panicking in the video, the other officers seem to be fairly calm, cool, and collected. You don't hear them yelling. The only one you can see is trying to pull Mr. Wright out of the vehicle, whereas the Officer Potter seems very flustered. She's yelling, and she's pulled out this weapon right away. Now, I've criticized the police in other videos for going straight to tasers or here straight to a firearm. I think it's highly concerning in these circumstances she pulled a firearm. Now, defense counsel for her might argue, well, he could have had a gun in the car. That may be, but to me, this goes back to, again, that question of overuse of tasers. And I complained about this in the Ocean Weisblatt video, where there seems to be a tendency among police that they think since tasers are generally non-deadly, certainly a lot less deadly than a pistol, they're more likely to deploy them rather than using some less lethal option or an option that doesn't involve the use of a weapon. So that is at play here in my view, and that's a policy consideration, but I can't envision any explanation other than gross incompetence and negligence for this officer to pull a sidearm and somehow think that she has a taser in her hand. Now again, going off the video, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me that she would have had the presence of mind to, at the time, be pretending that she has a taser when she knows she has a firearm in her hand. So she may have legitimately thought she had a firearm, but in my view, you'd have to be completely incompetent to think that you're holding a taser under those situations, or at best, not trained at all how to deal with the stress of a situation like this. So in my view, an appropriate charge in this scenario for this officer would be criminal negligence causing death, if we were looking at the Criminal Code of Canada, at minimum, or perhaps a manslaughter. But I don't think there's evidence that this is a murder. I also don't see any evidence that this was a race-based killing. Frankly, I know a lot of police officers. I've encountered a lot of police officers. I really don't think many of them go out each shift thinking, boy, I hope I can find a black person to murder on my shift tonight. I just don't think officers go out looking to kill people of any race. This comes down to incompetence and negligence. The police have been using the term accidental discharge. Well, when I was in the Army, there was no such thing as an accidental discharge. There's a negligent discharge, and in the Army, negligent discharge, you're automatically charged. You're arrested, and now you might just get a fine depending on the circumstances. Like if you negligently discharged a blank, you could get a fine, but it's serious business. It's not serious business with police, and in my view, it should be serious business with police. And this is another problem that factors in here. In my view, defunding police is not the answer. Proper training and reform of police is what's needed, and that requirement has reared its ugly head in this case again. I've raised the issue of lack of training. Lack of accountability is another problem, and especially accountability in safety with firearms. Let me just give you one example from 2007 in Waterloo Region. So this is an article from CTV News entitled, Ontario Police to Review Procedure After Gun Missing. Police in Kitchener, Ontario say it is too early to speculate whether an officer who misplaced his full-duty kit bag, which contained a gun, will be reprimanded for the incident. It goes on to say, police continue to search for the undercover officer's bag that went missing during a drug investigation near Kitchener Collegiate Institute on Tuesday. Now, this is a huge problem right here, that police were considering whether to reprimand this officer. Now, I couldn't find any follow-up to what happened, so I frankly suspect nothing happened to this officer, but a reprimand was all they were considering. I can tell you, as a civilian, if I left a handgun laying in a bag and it just got lost one day, I wouldn't be filming this video. I wouldn't be a lawyer because I'd be in jail and I'd be disbarred because I would have been charged and convicted for at least careless storage of a firearm and storage of a firearm contrary to regulations. So this double standard and lack of accountability leads to an overly casual attitude towards firearms. And again, in my view, that's what came into play here. An overly casual attitude, not that emphasis on safety and being always in control of your firearm and in control of which direction it's pointing. I mean, these are things that were drilled into me as an officer in the Canadian Army. These are things that have been drilled into me as a lawful firearms owner, taking firearm safety courses and taking follow-up courses since then, which Anecdotally, just going back again to the lack of police training, I've spoken to numerous people in the firearms community, including people who offer further training in firearms in Canada and the United States, and it's an often repeated complaint that when police officers take these courses, their skill and safety with firearms is woefully inadequate and far below that of civilians. So these are all big institutional problems. They don't excuse the officer's gross negligence, in my view. In Canada, I think criminal negligence charge would be wholly appropriate. My personal view as a criminal defense lawyer is that she should be charged. But in my view, I don't see evidence of some race-based or hate-motivated crime. This video is not legal advice. If you have any situation where you need legal advice, please call another lawyer or call myself. My 1-855 number is listed below, and we'd be happy to give you some specific advice tailored to your specific situation. If there's any topics that you'd like to hear me cover on this channel, please leave a comment in the comments box below. And if you found this video interesting, informative, or useful, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing.